This fisheye lens is a little weird, but it works pretty well. Okay, we're here. We're here. Happy, what is it? September. Wow, September 1. How about that? Labor Day's coming up, so hope everyone has a wonderful Labor Day weekend. Hopefully have you some good plans. Today we're going to talk about what are we talking about? We're talking about adrenal health, we're talking about thyroid health, we're talking about the connection between them. And we're going to talk about maybe some solutions here because there's a lot of it going on. And remember, like we've talked about this before, right? The majority of the reason, most of the time, why people go to doctors in one form or another is because of stress. Somewhere between 70 and 80-ish% of all doctor's visits are due to stress in some way. You can trace that back. So if it's that prevalent, if it's that common, you have to understand that there are things that we kind of need to work on, things that are potentially in our control, and things that we need to address so that we can adapt to stress in a better way. Right. So let's kind of peel the layers back, a little bit. We talk about this a lot, right? Like, remember, at the end of the day, there are only three forms of stressors available. They're physical, chemical, emotional. Physical, you could talk about things like maybe pain. Maybe it's, joint pain, maybe it's muscle pain and aches, headaches, could be something like that. Chemical, again, this could be something like blood works. It could be skin rashes. It could be um, anything related to your gut health. Are you pooping on a regular basis? How you're sleeping? There's a neurotransmitter component. There's a blood chemistry component. All of these things are really important when you're talking about physical, chemical, stresses. And then we come to emotional stresses, and now we're talking about things. This could be high blood pressure. If you hate the job you do, or you were just reamed out by your boss. It could be anxiety, depression, or impulse control. You're not able to kind of keep it together and you have to kind of let something out. Like, all of these things are potentially signs of an emotional stressor. Now, particularly men don't like talking about that. And we're usually in a society right now, especially when we're told to continue to go, and essentially put everything on the back burner until something kind of explodes. And that's not so great at the end of the day. And when we have, these physical, chemical, emotional stresses, and we're going to get into how they relate to thyroid and adrenal health, what we see is we have to kind of take a step back here, right? Like, we have to understand that things like high blood pressure, or high blood pressure itself, hypertension, is not a disease, right? It is an adaptation to a stress. Same thing with cholesterol. Now, I talked about that in my post this morning on Instagram, but you have to remember that the liver creates somewhere between 80 and 90% of the circulating cholesterol we have in our bodies. It is largely not from diet. Now, what we consume can affect our cholesterol levels because it's really an adaptation to inflammation. So things like super high amounts of poor quality saturated fats, or fats in general, processed sugars, these are things that are going to raise cholesterol because it creates an inflammatory environment. It's not because the foods themselves have cholesterol. That makes up maybe 10 to 20% of the total cholesterol you will have circulating at any given moment in time in your body. It's also important to have cholesterol in certain amounts because, remember, cholesterol makes up half of the weight of your brain. We need it for all of the sex hormones, all of the other hormones that are made in the adrenal glands, the corticosteroid hormones. Though you need cholesterol to make them, they are the precursor to it. So that's where, if you check that post I did this morning talking about pregnenolone and pregnenolone steal, are the concept of it. What is a fact, whether you want to debate how exactly that works, but what is a fact is cholesterol is the precursor to pregnenolone, which is a precursor to all of those steroid hormones. So have to understand that. We take things like type 2 diabetes, that is something that is virtually entirely man-made, right? It's is it a disease or is it an adaptation to very poor intake, poor dietary choices over a period of time? Because you can, and I've helped other people do this. You can reverse it. You can, like, now listen, if you get to a point where where it's been crazy for a really long time and you get a gangrenous toe or something, you might not be able to reverse that, but that takes a hell of a long time to get to that point. And you can get this under control because it is literally made from the environment being what we put in our bodies. Bowel disorders, too. These are essentially reactions to what's going on in your environment, right? So, if you're constipated, if there's loose stools, if there's indigestion, if there's bloating, that is to some degree inflammation going on in the gut. And that is your reaction, a response to it. And over time, we have to listen to these signs and symptoms because they are signs that something is off and something needs to be done to kind of change it. So as long as we start thinking about this a little bit differently, then we could start getting to solutions where this starts to make a lot more sense. So when you're talking about signs, like if they're stressed, I mean, I'll give you a few right now, like that you could take note of and use in your daily life. The first is, are you having a bowel movement at least one every day, anywhere between one and three? If you are having less, which is very common, that is a sign of stress in that fight or flight state. Sleeping. How do you sleep? I talk about this all the time. Breathing is a really important part of this, but if you are you sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night? Are you waking up feeling refreshed? Because believe it or not, it is not normal to wake up and feel exhausted every day and feel the need to rely on something like, caffeine to get you going. You should wake up feeling refreshed, feeling good. So those are two easy signs that you can take to the bank and be like, "Oh, is there some sort of stress? Could this be putting some sort of pressure, on my adrenals, on my thyroid?" And for me, those two markers are realistic ones to start working on with people because we have to get to that point if you want to fix the underlying stuff. So to me, those are our baselines. It sounds super simple because sometimes it is, but it's like these basic things are the things we need to do if you really want to get optimal function from your thyroid, from your adrenal glands. Follow? And so this kind of brings out the backdrop of the context, right, of 2022, right, where we live in a world where we have a generally unhealthy population. We have, we're talking about 1 in 6 children, and this is a decade old, have some sort of developmental disability. 1 in 8 need special education. 1 in 11 have ADHD. 1 in 12 have asthma. 1 in 13 have food allergies. We know the rates of autism continue to go up, and we're talking about almost 1 in 280 children are going to be diagnosed with cancer by age 20. Things it's kind of wild, and we also know that 54% of total children, as of 2007, so and this number's gone up, 54% of them suffer from a chronic health condition. So we just live in a generally sick environment, and we're seeing now the latest generation really bearing the brunt of this, and it's going to have downstream effects in our future. But so we're seeing higher disease rates. We're seeing a lot of economic instability by being told, if you are essential or not, which is preposterous to even think of. We know we're talking about toxic food in a toxic environment. When you put on the news, which instills fear based in you, you wonder why, we have such a general high stress rate when you're talking about the average person, particularly American, that is really, really, causing issues here. So let's bring it back now to adrenals and thyroid. Now, adrenals makes more sense because we're talking about stress, right? But we have to, again, kind of unfold and take this kind of back a step, right? Because none of this stuff happens overnight. So if there's adrenal fatigue, if there are thyroid issues, these are not things that occur, that happen overnight. These are things that need to happen kind of over a period of time. So, if someone who's 25 says, oh, they might have a low functioning thyroid, well, and then, later in life, maybe there's issues with fibroids, maybe there's a hysterectomy, maybe there's, a issues with the gallbladder, maybe there's issues with that, maybe there's a surgery down the road with that. These things add up over time. And we have to understand, like, it has to come back to the environment. It's not necessarily, always bad luck or bad, you know, genes that are causing a lot of what's going on here. So where does this all kind of go, right? So we're talking about stress. Remember, comes from three sources: physical, chemical, emotional. And in stress, if you are stressed, and stress is actually really, really cool, right? Like, it actually really is like, we need cortisol. Like, we need to survive right now to make it to tomorrow. It's actually like a pretty brilliant system the way it's set up. So if we're stressed, we know things happen. We know our heart rate's going to go up. We know our blood pressure is going to go up to pump blood to the muscles, to the through the nervous system. So we are aware of our environment. So we have that heightened awareness. Our blood sugar is going to rise because glycogen stores are going to be broken down, so we could get glucose to muscles so that we can move and work on a better to function better, to move quickly if we need to. Same thing with cholesterol levels; those are going to go up. Cortisol is going to go up, and all the stress hormones are going to go up. In that same environment, there's certain things that are going to be down regulated because they're not as important in the moment. Digestion is not as important in a life or death situation. The immune system fighting a virus, bacteria, a fungal imbalance, parasites, whatever it is not necessarily as important in the moment if you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. Repairing tissue takes a back seat because we need to survive to tomorrow to be able to do that. Thyroid, it as a whole, also is kind of put to the back seat. So this is so in an acute situation, stress is really important, and it really helps save us, literally keep us alive. That's actually the function of it. The problem comes when we rely on this system, or when this system is triggered all of the time. And in our modern environments, maybe being late for a deadline or being yelled at by your boss, like, actually triggers a similar response to if you are running from your life because you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. And if that mode is constantly turned on, then we get, again, increased cortisol, decreased thyroid stimulating hormone. So, and we're going to get to that in a second. So, increased stress on the adrenals, the thyroid becomes underactive. And what you get over time, you'll see something known as centripetal obesity. Basically, you start adding fat around the stomach, the butt, and the limbs will start to be skinnier, not in proportion to it. So, there's a high cortisol, high stress state if you see someone with a round belly. That's one of the telltale signs of it. And now, like, when we're talking about getting, the thyroid and adrenal involved, it's important to kind of take a look back at the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Now, the hypothalamus is interesting because it's the one part of the body that is part nervous system, part endocrine system. And we've talked about the difference about these before, right? The nervous system is what I want right now. I could snap my fingers. Hormones take a little bit longer, but their effects are much broader. So, if I move my hand right now, that's it. It's over. There is no really lasting effect from that. But if I'm stimulating the release of thyroid hormones, that's going to eventually affect every organ system in our body over time. It might not happen in an instant, but it's going to happen, and it's going to be more dramatic long term. So the endocrine system, which is built on hormones, which are essentially just chemical messengers, they are going to communicate. They're tend to have more profound effects, but they take a little bit longer to kick in and a little bit longer to take the gas off of. Now, when we're talking about how this relates to the thyroid and the adrenals. Now, remember, you have thyroid releasing hormone, which is in the hypothalamus. That is going to go to the pituitary gland, which is going to stimulate TSH. And then TSH is going to go down to the thyroid, which stimulates the creation of more thyroid hormone. And then as thyroid hormones build up in the blood, there is a feedback loop, a negative feedback loop back to the hypothalamus saying, hey, we don't need any more thyroid hormone. Let's slow down the production of it. And then that system will start to slow down. So it's a negative feedback loop that actually regulates the production of thyroid hormone. Pretty cool. So that's actually pretty interesting. Now, what also is interesting is the hypothalamus. It also plays a role in this HPA axis, this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis versus the the hypothalamic pituitary, essentially thyroid axis. So in a stress state, you're going to get CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone. That's going to go to the pituitary and then to the adrenals, where you're going to get cortisol made. And when cortisol rises, TSH also goes down. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. So if you're getting cortisol made, that's also going to go back to the pituitary, say, hey, we don't need more TSH right now. So thyroid hormone levels are going to start to come down. So there's two different negative feedback systems here. It's the thyroid hormones themselves, but also it can be in elevated cortisol levels. So sometimes adrenal fatigue and thyroid type symptoms, there's a lot of overlap because it could be from either one or sometimes both of those negative feedback loops. So it's really important to kind of figure that out and understand that. Now, like usually when you're going to go to a doctor's office, you might get something like usually thyroxine, which they'll say is like a bioidentical hormone replacement. Technically, it's not truly identical. What thyroxine can do is actually it can actually make sometimes hypothyroid even worse over time, which can be an issue sometimes in some people. So it's not a true, replacement type of hormone here. And it's really important again, which is why we need to talk about, what are some of those underlying stresses? And we talked about the main three. Now, the variations of that's going to be different for everyone, but it's really important to address those if we want to bring some sort of regularity back to this system here. Now, when we're talking about thyroid hormones, there's two big ones. There's T3 and T4. There's roughly 20 times the amount of T4 as there is to T3. We need T4 to be converted to T3 because T3 is essentially the active form. It's more potent than T4. And this happens in the liver, the intestine, the kidneys, and the lungs. We also need certain nutrients that are really, really important here. So things like selenium. I know we talk about iodine a lot, and that is true. We need that, but selenium is really, really important for T3 production. That transition from T4 to that conversion, I should say, from T4 to T3. Selenium is really important. So other nutrient deficiencies, we're going to get into those. Heavy metals can be real issues, especially if you're getting exposure from different halogens. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Adrenal stress. Now, we talked about that mechanism a little bit earlier. That's really important. If you have oxidized oils, especially seed oils, processed foods, we're talking about, again, your canola, your soy, sunflower vegetable oils. These are super, super inflammatory and they can cause real issues with the thyroid, with your adrenal glands, because they're going to mess up that omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid ratio. And we're going to see kind of how this kind of comes through. So that's a lot. That's a lot like we've kind of already gone over here. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind. But, when we have basically what I'm trying to say is when we have physical, chemical, emotional stress, that's going to increase stress hormones. That's going to decrease the amount of TSH. When you have low TSH, you're going to have low thyroid hormones being produced, and that's going to decrease thyroid production. That's going to slow down digestion. That's going to slow down dopamine and serotonin, because most of the serotonin is made in the gut. Around 50% of dopamine is manufactured in the gut by microbes. So having a healthy gut's really important. Certain medications can do it. Sleeping pills, antidepressants, H2 blockers, PPIs, antacids. I talk about those all the time. Sometimes bioidentical hormones can do it too. Now, when we're talking about the adrenals are really cool, right? Because it's really cool because you have a system in the kidneys that is designed to filter your blood throughout the day. All of the blood in our body gets cycled through our kidneys multiple times a day. And it's really cool that you have these two glands located right on top of these kidneys that function essentially as. It's really cool. I heard this from Dr. John Bergman. I actually like this analogy. He called the adrenals the body's pharmacy, which I thought is really cool. Reason being, the adrenals produce all our sex hormones, mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids. You're talking about progesterone, talking about testosterone, talking about your estrogens, talking about cortisol. All of these are created in the adrenal glands, which is, really cool. So again, kind of call it the pharmacy of the body. I really like that. I'm probably going to steal that, but that's a really cool analogy that I kind of enjoy. The interesting thing with adrenals, and this is why I think a lot of people out there are like, oh, adrenal fatigue doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. There aren't really any clinical findings until you destroy 90% of the cortex of the adrenal glands. So you're talking about major damage has to be done to these glands before any clinical signs will come up. That's why I think largely, because we're always looking for cause and effect, kind of like in this paradigm that we're in right now. But the truth is, like, these things happen. We call it like subclinical, but just because like it's not like we don't have to wait till that much damage is done to do something, or maybe even have an idea that, hey, this might be, something that's playing a role here. So like that's kind of the conundrum we're at, and we have to kind of understand, like, hey, like there's a difference between, true health and, waiting for essentially a disaster to happen before taking some charge here and having a proactive stance, when it comes to your health. And it's really, really important. Cortisol in itself is really important, right? Like it's actually a pretty amazing molecule in terms of like what it can do, because it allows us to respond in such an efficient way to stress. The problem is just where there's too much of it, or we rely on that too much. And there's this balance between, cortisol and thyroid function, or adrenals and thyroid function in a way. It's essentially that it works kind of like a scale, right? So, like we know what can raise cortisol, right? It's low thyroid because they kind of go hand in hand. If there's inflammation, then we're going to have again more of a sympathetic type response. If there's stress, we're going to have more of a sympathetic type response. If there is, tissue damage for some reason, we're going to have a more sympathetic like response. If we're exposed to certain medications or heavy metals or toxic foods that are loaded with pesticides, or uh, things that are going to mess up the gut microbiome. Like these are all going to be things that are going to leave us in a more stressed state and raise cortisol levels. Now, how do we lower it? We have to do things that are going to manage our thyroid, improve our gut health, manage stress. Is it, doing some sort of deep breathing? Is it taking some time for prayer? Is it getting outside in the sun? Is it going for a walk in the woods or on the beach, or taking some time for yourself, or just something that allows you to give you a chance to de-stress? Are we having healthy food that's predominantly, healthy, organic, fruits and vegetables? Are we drinking clean water? Because fluoride is going to be an issue. Are we able to manage stress, appropriately? What could affect the thyroid negatively? Again, obviously high cortisol, because remember, we're talking about a scale here. Is the liver overworked, or is there a toxic liver? Are we not supporting that with antioxidants? Fluoride can do it. Pesticides, estrogens. Remember, a lot of these pesticides, a lot of these kind of chemicals that are issues, they're known as endocrine disruptors. Most of them tend to be estrogen based, which is why we see estrogen dominance sometimes a lot in women, and then in men, it actually lowers sperm counts and sperm quality. It lowers sex drive, and in women, you'll see it happen more with things like PCOS or fibroids or issues with menses. That becomes a big one, and it's fertility on both sides. So it's not just like that. Estrogen is important for for women. It's a huge thing for men, too. So that's kind of like where we're going. Like what we need to understand is like what's going on, and the balance between thyroid health and cortisol or and adrenal health is that there's kind of a balance between them, and sometimes one might be diagnosed as the other, and you kind of have to address kind of like the whole picture here. And remember, like we talked about cortisol, like short term it's really helpful. It's going to improve heart and blood vessel tone. It's going to increase blood sugar levels to get that to areas where we need it, like muscles, like the brain, because we need to be alert. It's going to have anti-inflammatory action short term, but long term, again, we're talking about if we're always stressed, if those adrenals are always turned on, if cortisol is always being churned out, poor cognitive performance, low thyroid or inhibited thyroid function, blood sugar issues, osteoporosis, sleep issues, decreased muscle mass over time, increased blood pressure, immune function issues. Wound healing is going to be a little bit slower. Recovery is going to be a little bit slower. And we talked about that abdominal fat. So we have to understand like it's really about finding that balance. Now, another thing that's going to be an issue when we're talking about thyroid is fluoride. There's no way around this. I mentioned this before, but all of the halogens, so if you look at a periodic table, they're all in the level or the row kind of right over from the right. It's the second one over from the right. You'll see fluoride, you'll see iodine. They're all kind of in that same area, right? Now, interestingly, you I don't know if you knew this, but in the 1800s, fluoride was used as an anti-thyroid treatment, believe it or not. Now, slowly that's began to change, and you see in a lot of countries today, fluoridating the water has essentially been taken out. A lot of the EU, Japan, China, they've kind of actually like jumped onto this, but in the US, like this is still a huge thing. Um, like fluoride is a known neurotoxin. That's just what it is at the end of the day. And if we're constantly drinking that type of water, it is going to cause issues long term, particularly neurological type issues, memory, brain fog. It's going to also affect energy levels and thyroid function because fluoride can inhibit how iodine function in the body too. Again, a lot of those halogens, they can kind of interact with each other and affect iodine and thyroid function long term. And fluoride ends up in a lot of things that you might not think of. We talk about water, but what about things like, like your sodas, like your Coca-Cola or your Snapples or your beer, right? Because if they're using fluoridated water, that's going to end up in those drinks. And you have to understand that. Like it's more than that because it's always those other things too that are going to play a key role. Now I mentioned those halogens. So chlorine's one, fluorine, bromine, these can all act like iodine and they compete with iodine for iodine receptors. So in other words, you may actually have or get enough iodine, but if you're consuming a lot of chlorine or fluorine or bromine, these are going to be things that affect the thyroid because they're going to compete for the same receptors. So where does this come from when we're talking about today? And it's interesting for things like bromine. Bromine was banned in the UK in the 90s, and Canada also in the 90s. But you'll see it in things like plastics, in fire retardants. So on a lot of furniture nowadays. If pool or hot tub treatments that they can contain bromine. Even some flowers and soft drinks could have them today. So and pesticides too, especially. And when you're talking about this, then it's going to come back to gut health too, right? When you take things that affect the gut, when you're consuming things like pesticides that we know can punch holes in the gut and lead to leaky gut, what happens is then we get proteins that are not digested either because we don't have enough stomach acid or we're not chewing our food properly. Then the immune system's going to detect them because now they can get through gaps that are bigger than they otherwise should be. And when that happens, the immune system basically recognizes these things that aren't broken down as foreign, and then we have an immune type reaction. So when we see things like leaky gut, that is why we're seeing a larger amount of things like autoimmune diseases kind of come into play, like lupus, like diabetes type 1, like RA and psoriasis, because a lot of it's going to be absorption issues, gut issues, leaky gut type issues. Um, it's from GMOs, it's from antibiotics, it's from other prescription drugs, particularly like the ones I was talking about earlier. The antidepressants, but also the big one, birth control ones are big, but also a lot of the stomach acid reducing drugs are going to cause issues with this. Um, Having a functioning gallbladder is really important too. This is why bitters are really important. Having really bitter herbs and adding spices to your food, really important so you can stimulate that. And then the estrogens, like I talked about, xenoestrogens, right? These are things that act like estrogens in the body. Things like, plastics or Teflon cookware or water bottles or hormones and antibiotics used in meats, in conventional meats. Cosmetic products are a huge one, birth controls, pesticides. All of these things act as xenoestrogens, which again throw off this balance and are going to affect not only how your adrenal glands function, but also how your thyroid functions. When you have excess estrogens, these are things that are becoming more common. Low thyroid, low functioning thyroid is one of them. Why? Because we're having a stress on the body that's going to decrease thyroid function. When you have that, now we're getting low thyroid, and now we're talking about potentially low energy, poor sleep, and then excuse me, on top of it, we're talking about things like, why fibroids are more common, or PCOS or endometriosis are becoming more common. It's because of this imbalance and in a lot of these compounds that are not necessarily found in nature, right? So, what are some things like that we can do that are going to make a big difference, like right now? Now, I alluded to this before. The omega 3 6 ratio is really, really important to kind of hone in on. So balancing that is going to be key. In an ideal world, we would have a 1-to-1 ratio of omega 6 to omega 3 fatty acids. Where we know disease starts is roughly around 8-to-1. Now, your typical American diet is around 20-to-1, 20 times the amount of omega 6s to omega 3s. And this is why vegetable oils are such a problem, man. Corn oils at roughly 60-to-1, safflower oils at 77-to-1. A lot of these oils, these canola, grapeseed, corn oil, really, really high in these oils. And when we're talking about an almost equal ratio, this is going to skew it into such an inflammatory state where we're not really going to have a chance, like if we don't address this properly. And also like having things that are going to affect the kidneys is really important. So, beets are great for helping clean the blood. Now, beets are tricky because if you have them, you might see, red stool or red urine, and that could freak you out. But really good. Antioxidants, particularly in things like berries and leafy greens, are huge. Um, Citrus is great, especially lemon and lime. Seaweeds are great of all kinds. So getting sea vegetables is going to be really helpful, not only for the kidneys but also the thyroid. Now, when we're talking about adrenal, oh man, someone posted something yesterday. I was trying to see this. She was talking about like adrenal cocktails, and there's some pretty easy ones you can make. Usually they have some form of vitamin C in there. Niacin, vitamin B3, really, really good for energy. So niacin, look up a list of uh, that foods that are high in vitamin B3 or B vitamins in general. These are going to be really, really helpful for energy, boosting your energy levels. Making sure you're getting enough selenium is really important. Nuts and seeds are really good. Brazil nuts are kind of the almost like poster child food for that. But plenty of nuts and seeds, beans, you can get selenium in. Vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin C, these antioxidants really good. Vitamin C also really helpful to help balance um, or bring some sort of balance back to your adrenal glands. Adaptogenic herbs, rhodiola, ginseng, eleuthero, ashwagandha. Those are the big ones off the top of my head right now. Those are ones that are really, really helpful in helping manage that and help bring this back. And remember, this stuff takes time. Like, on average, if it's mild to moderate, these could be something that you have to work on for like 9 months to a year. Like, these are things that are not going to necessarily change overnight. But if you keep with it, if we're getting rid of that toxic stuff, we can make changes fairly quickly. Heavy metals, making sure we can get out of things like mercury, um, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and bind those and get those out. Using things like chlorella, spirulina, binders, like different types of clays can be really helpful. And these are things that, like, if interested, like we could work on that together. So those are kind of like some of the basic things that we can do to kind of make a big difference. But like, again, we have to understand like what the causes are here, right? There's a ton of different environmental toxins. There's an inordinate amount of stress just in our, not only in our individual lives, but also just in that is projected onto us from the outside world. High fructose corn syrup, in sodas, in foods, crazy out of control. Just the general standard Western American diet. The use of medications. We're 5% of the world's population, yet we use 50 some odd percent of all prescription medications. These will affect the gut and will have issues downstream. Refined foods. These are going to be real issues. How do we fix it? We have to get clean water if we can. I know Dr. Brad just did a big thing on different types of water filters, but the best two that are general that you can get are still probably AquaTrue and Berkey. You can get water filtration systems if you live in a more permanent home. That's obviously going to cost you more, but they do the job and honestly are probably the best. More organic fruits and vegetables to get rid of those pesticides as much as we can. Try working with someone if you're taking a medication. You know, Ask your doctor why, and is there a way that you could potentially get off of it? Because the more informed and educated you are, the more tools and ammo you have at your disposal to make a difference long term. Try to listen. There's no way we're going to eliminate all the environmental toxins in our world, but just do the best we can. Maybe it is new makeup or new soaps or new shampoos or new cookware. Like, take it one at a time, new cleaning products. Take it one at a time, but there's always ways we can work it out. And the way I tell people I work with up front, I'm like, listen, use up what you have. When you have to go to the store again, buy something new. You can upgrade as you have to, replenish over time. It's an easy way. It takes stress off of it. Like you can just as you're doing it, you replace this stuff with better things as you go along. And stress. Is it um, you know, NLP? Is it NET? Is it tapping? Is it EFT? Is it prayer, meditation? Is it just hanging out with friends? Like, what is the stress relief tool that you have? And more importantly, like, is there a way that you can help balance like some of this emotional stuff? Is it dealing with, a past trauma that if has been pushed to the side? That might be what it takes. And if you have to, work with someone on it. But those are the three main kinds of stress. I know I always come back to this. It's physical, chemical, emotional. You address it and come back to it. So that's what we got for today. I hope that makes a lot of sense, but that's to me is kind of how I look at, thyroid and adrenal health. I hope that's helpful. Um, if you ever want to work with me, like I said, feel free to get in touch with me, in the DMs or shoot me an email at drvincentesposito@gmail.com. Still working with new people online. Still actually just getting started, believe it or not, taking an iridology course. So that's going to be something I'm going to be talking about more if you want to get some cool kind of consultations with that stuff too. But um, hope you enjoyed this one. Be back next week with a topic that I will likely also pick next Thursday. So see you then. Have a good one. Peace.